Hi everyone, I'm Susan Birch and welcome to another episode of The Health Detective. Today I am very delighted to have Dr. Rachel Brown with me. Dr. Rachel Brown is a metabolic psychiatrist, so we'll get her to explain to you exactly what that means. And she has written a wonderful book for the public called Metabolic Madness. Metabolic Madness, yes, that's right. So, Rachel, thanks for coming, and we're really keen to hear what you have to say about how we can look after our mental health using nutrition.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to be here and to have a good conversation around all the connections between what we eat and our diet and our mental well-being and mental health in general. I must say my main interest is metabolic psychiatry, although I practice as a mainstream general adult psychiatrist within the NHS in the UK. So I can talk about that as well.
Sounds great. Well, let's start with the metabolic psychiatry. Can you tell us what that means?
Yeah, so metabolic psychiatry is a field that's very much in its infancy. So it's not really a part of mainstream practice, certainly in the UK. And as far as I'm aware, it's not really part of mainstream psychiatric practice worldwide yet. It is a rapidly growing field, however, and there are many clinicians across the world who have seen success in their patient groups by implementing metabolic therapies within their standard treatment protocols. And I think metabolism is always a hard concept to grasp because there are many things involved in metabolism. I suppose a simplistic way of thinking about it might be thinking about just energy supplies and demands within the body and how the body processes energy. And obviously our nutrition and our food intake and our lifestyles all play a part within that. So the biggest movement at the moment in terms of metabolic psychiatry is really there's ongoing research and practice into the use of ketogenic diets for major mental health disorders. And with a ketogenic diet being a very low carbohydrate diet. So typically a diet where somebody would limit their total grams of carbohydrates per day to 50 grams or less in order to induce a state of nutritional ketosis. I admit I don't know how familiar your listeners are in relation to all things keto, whether it's worth explaining that anymore.
Some will be and some won't be. So there's always the sort of low carb followers in the audience. And then also I try and reach a wider audience and start to introduce them to some of these concepts so that they're understanding them a bit better. So yes,
okay.
Perhaps you explain nutritional ketosis a little bit. I think it's worth an explanation because there's so many variations of ketogenic diets, and I think there's a lot of understanding about nutritional ketosis as well out there in the public. So it's probably worth an explanation.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So where to start? So there are three basic macronutrients in the diet. So three types of nutrients that we can get our energy supply from, and those are being kind of glucose or carbohydrates, proteins and fats. And it's quite a complex subject because fats and proteins have many essential roles within the human body in terms of being precursors to hormones and building blocks of proteins and collagen and all sorts of contributions towards the structural aspects of our body. But carbohydrates themselves really only have one function, and that's to provide energy. So there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate is essentially what I'm getting down to. So the fats and proteins serve various other purposes in the body, whereas the carbohydrates don't. So nutritional guidelines come into this because certainly in the late 70s and early 80s when there were various nutritional guidelines that were released advising people to base their diet largely around complex carbohydrates, grains, fruits and vegetables, other sugars and so on. And when you look at the trends in terms of diabetes, particularly the rates of type 2 diabetes and obesity trends across the world, there's quite a correlation following the introduction of those dietary guidelines and a deterioration in global health in general. So skyrocketing rates of type 2 diabetes and obesity primarily is what I've seen in terms of graphs, but there'll be other chronic health conditions that tie into those that are also metabolic problems, such as high blood pressure and various other complications you can run into. It's hard to know where to go exactly. There's so much that I could, so many rabbit holes I could go down to with this.
Well, I think what we hear a lot about is, you know, we need carbs for energy, we need carbs for exercise, but that our brain uses, you know, such a huge amount of glucose. And so therefore we need to eat carbohydrates to keep the fuel to our brain. But what we're seeing is that there's an increase in brain disorders from excessive carbohydrate intake as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not wrong that the brain does run on glucose, and in some ways that might be the preferred fuel source for certain areas of your brain. There are certain areas in the brain where it's an essential source of nutrition and energy. However, we do know that in certain mental disorders, I suspect in actual fact, it will turn out to be a lot of different mental disorders, but there's more research in some areas than others. We do know that high levels of insulin over time cause damage and cause dysfunction at the blood-brain barrier, but also leads to something known as hyperinsulinemia, which is when you have chronically elevated levels of insulin in the body. And we know that your brain cells can become resistant to that insulin when they're constantly exposed to high levels. And that does play a part in mental disorders. We know that through the research. I think it's important for people to realize that when they do have a diet that's based primarily around carbohydrates, although guidelines tell us that sugar is bad for us, in actual fact, all of the carbohydrates are broken down in the body to simple sugars. And so any type of carbohydrate that you eat is likely, when you metabolize it, to cause a spike in your blood sugar or your blood glucose level. And the body's response then is to release insulin in order to bring down your level of glucose in your blood. And over time, what you see with high carbohydrate diets is that the body is continually, repeatedly producing insulin, and you end up in a high insulin state, or a hyperinsulinemic state would be the medical term for it. And there are various adverse health effects that come from this high insulin state, one of which is you run into problems with processing energy within your brain. So you develop something called cerebral glucose hypometabolism, which is essentially just dysfunctional metabolism within the brain. And you end up with very high levels of insulin in the brain, but the insulin is unable to drive the glucose into the cells because the brain becomes insulin resistant, and the insulin just doesn't have the same effect that it once did. So you effectively end up with a brain that is swimming in glucose, but your brain cells are unable to access that energy because of the insulin resistance that has developed. And what comes on the back of that is your brain doesn't work in the way that it should. So people might experience cognitive difficulties, memory issues, but it's also implicated in other mental disorders such as bipolar disorder, which is a major mental illness, depression. There's a huge overlap between type 2 diabetes and depression. And we know that if you have one, you're more likely to develop the other disease and vice versa. And type 2 diabetes is essentially end stage hyperinsulinemia or insulin resistance. And so all of these disorders are linked and tied together very closely. And I think the state of the research, probably the most that's been done, relates to Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So some researchers have even referred to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes, so which speaks for itself.
It does. So what you're saying there essentially is that our brains have got all this fuel that's available, but they can't use it. And they can't function properly, and they can't, and pathways can't work properly, and the brain is starving.
Absolutely. And that leads to common mental health symptoms that people may experience. And just bringing it back to nutritional ketosis. So that's the beauty of adopting a low carbohydrate lifestyle, where your body shifts from being primarily a sugar burner or a burner of glucose and carbohydrates. The body is able over time to shift over to burning primarily fats for energy. And it does this by upregulating changes within the cell at a cellular level. So mitochondria are crucial in this story and fit into this picture, but mitochondrial dysfunction also underlies many different disorders, including mental disorders as well. So there's a lot of evidence there now for that. So you go through an adaptation process when you limit your carbohydrate to a certain level. So we tend to stay below 50 grams, although actually a lot of people do well limiting even further, so even down to 20 grams to get into ketosis. So you go through roughly about 2 weeks of adaptation, and this is when your body is changing at a cellular level, and your mitochondria are changing the machinery that they use within them and shifting over from burning sugar to burning ketone bodies. And ketone bodies are just breakdown products of fat. Now, the beauty about ketones is that they are a very efficient fuel and a very clean fuel for your brain to use. So they cross the blood-brain barrier. And when you have this situation where you have high levels of insulin and your brain cells are resistant to that insulin and unable to access energy via insulin, your ketone bodies and ketones can still supply those brain cells with an alternative fuel source. And so that's why using nutritional ketosis can be paramount for treating different mental disorder symptoms, because it's upregulating a fuel source for your brain and providing a very clean source of fuel. And we know that ketones are actually a more efficient fuel source for the brain as well. So they provide more energy relatively than glucose would.
And it's interesting, you're talking about upregulating that mitochondrial function. I talk quite a lot about the mitochondria because that's sort of where our disease process starts, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And so when we've got too much energy backing up in the mitochondria, particularly from carbohydrates, we produce all this reactive oxygen species. We find it very hard to get rid of the toxic waste, I suppose, the exhaust that comes from that process. And so a ketogenic diet reduces that. And you talk in your book, I believe, about inflammation and the role that has on our metabolic health or our brain health.
Yeah, absolutely. So I often think of this as there are many different pieces to the puzzle, and it's impossible to isolate one particular mechanism from all the others, because we know that high glucose diets or high carbohydrate diets have been shown to drive inflammation within the body. And when you have inflammation, there are immune system effects that happen. So you have release of immune system mediators such as cytokines that contribute to more inflammation. And we know that when we have inflammation in the body, this can tip certain neurotransmitter systems out of balance and can lead to dysregulation and imbalances in the different neurotransmitters. So it's all about balance. And you have excitatory neurotransmitters that tend to make people, give them more drive, but also make them feel more anxious or agitated. And we know that when there's inflammation, there are certain pathways that lead to overproduction of those excitatory neurotransmitters, and then less of the more calming neurotransmitters such as GABA. Don't know how much detail people want, but that's essentially in a nutshell what happens. And you're absolutely right about reactive oxygen species. So oxidative stress comes into all of this as well. And I do often wonder about the role of and the importance of food intolerances, even in all of this, in systemic inflammation and mental disorders, because gut health and mental health are very interrelated. So I trained in functional medicine as well as being an allopathic doctor. And I think any functional medicine doctor will tell you that gut health is just paramount to overall health. And the state of your gut can have a profound impact and influence on the rest of your kind of bodily functions and your hormonal systems. So one of the big players is gluten, or wheat. So that leads directly to leaky gut, which some people may have heard of, or increased intestinal permeability. And it basically means that your gut wall is no longer tight, and it kind of opens up the junctions between the cells in your gut wall, and you can end up having toxins that leak through from the gut, toxins from certain bacteria that may be less than ideal that leak through the gut wall and then pass into your systemic circulation and can travel to distant sites, including the brain. And then, of course, when you have toxins or even foodstuffs that can leak through that then go on to cause inflammation, that can spark off an immune system reaction, which then further fuels inflammation in the body and leads to mitochondrial dysfunction. And so it kind of goes on and on, all the connections.
This big vicious circle. It's interesting. It's great that you were talking about the gut, because, you know, we hear a lot over here that you've got to eat more vegetables. You want gut health. To increase your microbiome diversity, please eat more vegetables.
So
I'd love to.
That's interesting. I think the research is still early days in terms of the research into the gut, but there's more and more research emerging that's linking gut health and gut dysfunction, such as dysbiosis. So that would be having unfavorable balance of microbes within your gut, to various mental disorders and various physical health disorders. And I think there's still a lot that we don't know there. I think, unfortunately, sometimes there's an assumption that certain foods promote gut health when probably in reality, when people adopt different lifestyles, they come to realize that there might not be a lot of truth behind those assumptions. So fiber is one of those aspects. So we've been told for years and years to eat more fiber. And I know there've been some really good talks. I think there may have been an Australian doctor, I forget his name, who did an excellent talk that I've watched online, but I've heard it from other sources as well. There's actually evidence that having too much fiber in your diet leads to diverticular disease and might increase your risk of diverticulitis. And I question the role of fiber in our diet. And I think a lot of people say, oh, eat more fiber because it feeds the bacteria in your gut, and then the bacteria in your gut produce short chain fatty acids, and this helps nourish gut health and has other roles in the body. But what they miss out is that you can get those short chain fatty acids from other food sources as well. So casein in kind of dairy protein is another potential source of short chain fatty acids. And I just think there's so much that we don't know, and the state of nutritional research is unfortunately not
still
all that reliable.
Still in its early stages, really.
Yes, and unfortunately a lot of it's associational data and with lots of confounding bias, and so it's difficult to draw firm conclusions from that. What I will say is, I do have a friend who's a functional medicine doctor in the UK, and he recently told me that he has been doing microbiome testing in his patients, and by far and large the healthiest microbiomes that he has seen have been in people who weren't eating fruit and vegetables. So it was people who had adopted a carnivore diet. So that's really interesting to hear.
And I see that in my clients as well. And I just think the anecdotal evidence from my clients is fruits and vegetables cause bloating and gas and discomfort and, often constipation, although, we're supposed to eat more to reduce constipation, or diarrhea in some people. And as soon as we go on a keto carnivore kind of diet, they go away and they feel so much better. And their mood improves and their brains better.
Yes, and to me, the only assumption I can make from that, because I've been in touch with so many people who've improved their mental health vastly using either a ketogenic approach or a carnivore approach to health, depending on their individual situation. But the only conclusion I can come to is that in the process, they have improved their gut health as well, because there are so many key connections between the gut and the brain. So there's a direct physical link via the vagus nerve. And we know that there's bidirectional communication between the gut and the brain. So one communicates with the other and vice versa. And we know that the bacteria in your gut produce the vast majority of your neurotransmitters that are used in your nervous system and your brain. And so it just follows that if you have an improvement in your mental health, it just seems logical that you must have improved your gut health in the process of that.
So can we talk a little bit about some specific sort of mental health problems that people face and how you manage them? And I'm thinking, I mean, I guess they come into different categories and different levels of difficulty for people, but we have, Alzheimer's and dementias, we've got Parkinson's disease, we've got epilepsy, which is kind of where the ketogenic diet first originated, isn't it? And then, sort of depression and anxiety disorders, ADHD. I'd love to hear, what your recommendations would be for people, with that range of problems that they're facing.
Yeah, so I think, and it's a bold statement, I'm just going to warn you, but I think most people could be benefited by adopting a low carbohydrate diet. So there might be certain caveats there. So there possibly some sports professionals who it would take a bit longer to properly adapt, and there might be a kind of temporary decrease in their sports ability while they're adapting to keto. But I think for the general population, most people could be benefited from going low carb. And when it comes to people with mental disorder and major mental disorder, I would go one step further and say particularly trying to pursue a ketogenic diet, because I think it's beyond anecdotal evidence now. The number of people that I've been in contact with who have improved their mental health using dietary strategies alone just cannot be ignored anymore. And I know that there's a reluctance of clinicians to adopt ketogenic strategies in the absence of gold standard randomized controlled trials into one condition in particular. But I think those trials are coming. So I'm involved in a local trial in Edinburgh, looking at the ketogenic diet in bipolar disorder. And so that's a pilot study, and there are several other similar studies being funded and underway across the world. So one in America, one in Australia. And that's with a view to going on to bigger studies as well. So I think that evidence is going to come. I think the evidence base as it stands just now, the most evidence that's been published relates to the role of the ketogenic diet in being able to prevent dementia and help with mild cognitive impairment. And there have been some studies that have shown benefit in relation to level of functioning in people with diagnosed Alzheimer's as well. So I think it's always worthwhile, even if somebody already has a diagnosis of that, to consider pursuing a ketogenic lifestyle, albeit I understand the stresses that can be involved with carers, with looking after somebody with dementia, depending on how advanced that dementia may be. And there can be difficulties after a lifetime of following one particular diet to then suddenly go and do quite a drastic overhaul, because let's face it, the majority of people's diets in the Western world leave a lot to be desired, I would say, in terms of how healthy they are, and reliance on processed and convenience foods, unfortunately, just seems to be the norm these days from what I can see. Which, sorry, just to go off topic slightly again, which just brings me to the subject of seed oils and the detrimental role that they play. So I don't know if that's something that you've spoken about on your show, presumably at some point in time it's been touched on, but these industrial seed oils that are just rife now, that just really have no place to serve in our diet. There are studies showing that they're detrimental in terms of physical health, cardiovascular health, and yet they're just widespread and unfortunately seem to be relied on following the dietary guidelines and the particular recommendation to minimize saturated fat intake. And the fundamental problem with them is that they are pro-inflammatory. So they have a balance of omega-6 fatty acids that skews our omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which should be close to 1-to-1, but these days the ratios are horrendous. So we take in far too much omega-6 fatty acids, for which seed oils are very rich and that puts us automatically into a pro-inflammatory state. And I know that there have been studies in ADHD, for example, that show that even children with ADHD have less than desirable omega-6 to omega-3 ratios. So they have much higher levels of omega-6 than omega-3 and levels that are different to normal controls even in their age groups. So I think that's another aspect, not just with ADHD, but with mental health in general across all disorders. I think excluding those from your diet can go a long way to helping to correct underlying metabolic dysfunction that results.
And so with seed oils, what Rachel's talking about, most of you will know this, are the vegetable oils. So things like canola oils and sunflower oil and, you know, all those sort of manufactured oils that come from vegetables that don't actually really have oils that extent in them.
The unstable and easily oxidized oils that then go on and wreak havoc in the body and oxidize your cholesterol and you know, directly contribute to chronic disease, unfortunately.
You know, there's an increasing association with, you know, various kinds of cancers and things as well. I think it's something to be aware of. And it's really difficult because, like you were saying, Rachel, every food product we pick up off the supermarket shelf has these oils in it.
Yeah.
And anytime we go out for a meal, our food is cooked in these. So it's very, very challenging.
Yeah, you have to become an avid label reader, or better still, just don't buy things that are prepackaged. Try and stick to whole unprocessed foods. But I know sometimes it's small steps for some people and making gradual changes. And I think just paying attention to ingredients, because you find these seed oils in all sorts of different things that you just wouldn't necessarily expect to find them in. So sometimes dressings and sauces that people think that might be marketed as keto or low carb have these, and some of those kind of convenience bars that might be keto have these seed oils in them as well.
And I think that's where, you know, in the beginning with keto, there was a huge drive to replace a conventional sugar-based processed foods, you know, our treats, with a ketogenic version, which often contained a lot of these omega-6 fats in them. And then keto went through a phase where people were saying, well, it's not working. And, you know, I lost some weight and then I stopped losing weight and I felt better, but now I'm not feeling better. And, you know, I think we call that kind of dirty keto now. So even with keto, you know, we're really wanting to get away from trying to replace all those treats and processed foods with ketogenic treats and processed foods. And like you say, they can have some terrible ingredients in them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that making keto treats or buying those sorts of products, I know that you can get cleaner versions of them. Certainly, I know in the UK, there are certain brands that make cleaner versions of keto treats. But I do worry about people who struggle with food addictions, and particularly carb and sugar addiction, because although those can be bridging products to get somebody to be able to reduce their carbohydrate intake quite successfully, it's been my own experience, and I know the experience of others, that continuing to include sweeteners and those replacement products can just continue to drive cravings for sugar and can make the whole process a lot more challenging and difficult for people to stick with keto, because if you still have those cravings for sugary foods, then it makes it an awful lot harder than if you don't have to deal with that.
I know that myself, and even if I eat, something that's got artificial sweeteners in it or alternative sweeteners in it, it fires my brain up really quickly.
Absolutely.
And all of a sudden I'm wanting to be, eating more of them.
Yeah, I had the same experience. So it wasn't until I managed to stop the diet drinks, with all those terrible sweeteners. They're dreadful sweeteners in those, but it wasn't until I got rid of those that I really stopped having any cravings for sweet things. And we know that all of those sweeteners lead to a very similar release of dopamine in the brain, in comparison with sugar. So it's really not really any different. It still has the same effect at brain chemistry level, and whether it's a sweetener or sugar.
It's been great that there's a lot more focus now on sugar addiction. And I've talked to, Annika Strandberg-Schmidt a few times, and Bish and Johnson, I'm sure. Yeah. And, I think they're doing wonderful work and educating people about the sugar addiction and helping to break the cycle. So if somebody has Alzheimer's disease, let's start with that. What kind of keto diet would you put them on? What kind of ratio of fat to protein would you be looking at? Or is that how you look at it? Do you look at it in that way?
Sometimes I'm not a huge fan of calculating exact ratios. However, I think it can be really important for some people. So I think there's quite a bit of bio-individuality, and there can be variation between one person and the next in terms of how strict they need to be with their macronutrients. So some people will get into ketosis quite easily, and it partly depends on your activity levels, but some people might get away with 50 grams of carbs a day, and others, they might have to be very strict and keep it 20 or even below. But you're aiming for a kind of high fat, moderate protein diet. So I tend to think about 80-20 in terms of fat, calories and protein. And it's difficult. So a lot of doctors practicing using the ketogenic diet, they do feel that it's very important to monitor ketone levels for people. I tend to take a view that I don't know that I can say it's absolutely essential for every single person. So I do know some people who have had quite a smooth transition going keto, where their mental health has improved and they haven't really had a need to monitor ketones very closely. But then I do know of others where other clinicians have been seeing them, and they've required to have very tight control in terms of their ketone levels. And sometimes you need to introduce other hacks essentially to try to boost somebody's ketone level, particularly in dementia. So that might be using the addition of MCT oil or ketone supplements that in a targeted fashion in certain situations. So
because I think I do see people without these disorders getting really obsessed about their ketone levels. And I'm not sure that that's, I don't know that we need to have that tighter control.
No, I agree. I think that can become unhealthy as well. So almost like a replacement for calorie counting or, tracking. Yeah, absolutely. So I think people should be guided by how they feel and what symptoms they have, definitely. But I think there will be certain situations where people might need to track ketones a bit more therapeutically, just for therapeutic reasons, if they're struggling to get their symptoms into remission.
And so that's when we're looking at, the dementias. What would you say? So maybe tighter control there. What would you say for something like epilepsy?
Oh, right. So, I'm not an epilepsy specialist. So in the UK, that would be neurologists who would primarily deal with those people. I think from what I know that there does tend to be some tracking that goes on with ketones there, but I can't say for certain. So we have a dietitian in the research study I'm working on, and she's been a ketogenic dietitian for a long time, and primarily employed within a neurology service. So that's certainly a question I could ask her, but I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head.
And then conditions like ADHD, I've interviewed doctors who specialize in ADHD management, and they all prefer a low carbohydrate diet.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So what would your recommendations be? And, it's tricky with children, isn't it? How do you get kids eating these diets?
Yeah. So I have a son myself, and you can see it from a very early age, just how early children get hooked on sugar and carbs. I think it's primarily sugar from what I've seen, but I know there are other people who struggle with other forms of carbohydrate. I don't think the recommendations are particularly any different for ADHD versus anyone else with any other mental health disorders. So it's primarily a very low carbohydrate diet, ketogenic. And I suppose my own personal recommendation would be to pay particular attention to your omega-6, omega-3 ratio. So not that you need to get into calculating that or tracking it, although you can get blood tests done to check where you're at with that, but just trying to make healthy choices in terms of the fats that you're taking in. So omega-3s, primarily you think of fatty fish for those sources, but there are other sources as well, egg yolks and beef. And
when we look at our animal foods, most animal foods have a really good omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. It's pretty much in that
already.
range. Yeah.
Yeah.
In that 1-to-1 ratio. And for anybody who might be listening, who could be concerned about eating saturated fat, do you want to put their minds at rest?
Right. Yeah. So that there have been studies done that show when, particularly since we're on the subject of seed oils, a study that showed adverse health outcomes when a population was introduced, seed oils were introduced to replace saturated fat. So actually their mortality rates increased and their rates of disease increased, and they had negative health outcomes. And that was a study, I think, from about 30 odd years ago, where they uncovered some missing data that hadn't been published the first time around. So
in the garage.
Yeah. And actually, if we think about saturated fats, they're generally stable fats, particularly for cooking. And all our concern should really be about unstable fats and fats that are prone to oxidation, because if they're prone to oxidizing in the bottle, then they're prone to oxidizing in your body as well. And then they're going to contribute to oxidative stress and reactive oxygen species, and having an imbalance between your pro-oxidants and your antioxidants in the body. And that's all going to drive inflammation and all of the things that we've been talking about before. Whereas your stable fats, such as saturated fats, are generally great for cooking, and some are, generally good at high temperature cooking. And so people just need to be mindful of what oils or fats they're using day to day in their cooking particularly.
And your own diet, would you give us a little bit of a background to your own way of eating, and,
Sure.
you chosen that, why you do that?
Yeah, sure. So I first got into low carb about 20 odd years ago when Atkins was all the rage. And I followed that intermittently for quite a number of years, but I never quite managed to stick with it very consistently. And in retrospect, I know now that was because of sugar addiction that I didn't fully recognize, and including too many kind of sweet treat type Atkins bars and so on, that really kind of derailed my progress there. And for many years, I thought that I had an emotional eating issue. So I didn't really recognize it was an actual sugar addiction. So I used to just not really fully understand why I had such a strong craving for sugar, and when I'd end up going back to eating things like chocolate and sweets. And I explored various groups and did a program all about kind of intuitive eating, that kind of angle for many years. And I think I had almost every book on the subject. There's some really great books out there, but ultimately nothing really helped very significantly. And then I've been a big fan of Mark Sisson for many years. So Mark's Daily Apple, read all of his books. I just really love the content that he puts out there. So it was around about, I'm trying to think, 10, 11 years ago now that I adopted a primal way of eating. So I still included high-fat dairy in my diet, but got rid of all grains and legumes, and still included vegetables and very low carbohydrate fruits. And then 6 years ago or thereabouts, I decided to convert to be properly keto. So I'd been low carb for a long time, but not fully keto. I'd never really checked ketones, and I know I wasn't having my carbs to a very strict low level. And it was Vanessa Spina, who I don't know if you're aware of, but ketogenic girl. So I really love a lot of her recipes, and I'd bought one of her plans just to make sure I was doing it absolutely properly. And it was just something she posted on social media one day when she was doing a carnivore trial herself. That was the first instant I ever heard of carnivore. And I really respect Vanessa and her views and her knowledge in the ketogenic world. And so I thought, that's absolutely crazy. What is she doing? I need to look into this, because I thought, well, she's doing it, there must be something to it. So it's about 3.5 years ago now, I went online and started researching the carnivore diet. And I stumbled across Michaela Peterson speaking at CarnivoreCon, telling her own story of overcoming multiple autoimmune health disorders such as rheumatoid arthritis that she'd had from a very young age, and also bipolar disorder and various mental health disorders that she overcame completely by changing to a very strict elimination diet that was a carnivore diet. And then after that, I watched Sean Baker speak at CarnivoreCon, and his talk just really hit home to me about the state of nutritional research and the problems with epidemiology, and us really not having any good evidence to support any of the nutritional guidelines that there have been, or any of the assumptions that people make about what is healthy versus what is not. And I just dove straight into carnivore after that. So I'm a bit of an all or nothing person, and just out of curiosity thought I need to try this, because it intuitively made sense, and from an ancestral health point of view, but also just everything that I'd heard and seen on those talks. And that was 3.5 years ago, and I just never looked back. So that's been 3.5 years carnivore, and it's just been the best health decision personally that I ever made. So I think there have been certain health problems that I'd lived with that I hadn't really been aware of. So I hadn't done it specifically to help any one health issue, but it has really clarified a few different issues that I think I was probably just living with but not fully appreciating. So, things like minor autoimmune issues like eczema, and the biggest thing for me has been the improvements in my immune health, in terms of I just don't get sick the way that I used to with common colds and viral illnesses, and also the food freedom that it has given me. So it really clarified my relationship with food, and in particular my sugar addiction. So even when I was keto, there were certain foods that were still a bit problematic, nowhere near what had gone on in years before, but like nut butters and kind of dark chocolate, so 90% or even 100% dark chocolate. There were certain foods that just felt slightly more compulsive. Yeah. I felt slightly more compulsive around than others. And carnivore has just been amazing for the satiety factor and being able to eat and feel fully nourished, and then go for hours and hours and hours not feeling hungry, not thinking about food, not being preoccupied by food in any shape or form. And it's just been very simplistic, and no calculating, no tracking macros, no tracking anything, because that just absolutely blows my mind.
Yeah, easy to cook. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I sort of got into low carb about 1998, when I suddenly had some education about insulin, and I'm like, oh my goodness, here's our solution to our obesity problem. And then it was probably about 6 years ago, I suppose, I've got the ApoE44 gene.
Okay, yeah.
So Alzheimer's suddenly, and I know that, I know it doesn't necessarily mean anything, and that, environment is so important. But anyway, there's a lot of talk about it being an increase in Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And so I started looking into that and found that the people with the 44 gene, were sort of like, that was the original ApoE gene, and, they ate sort of meat and fat. And I thought, I'll just start, I'll try that. I'll see what happens. And I was really embarrassed because, I'd go for dinner or eat with people. I'm like, I don't want to tell people I'm not eating. They'll think I'm nuts that I'm not eating. And then, of course, I had no idea that it was called carnivore, or that there were all these people around the world doing it. And then, of course, I started doing it. I'm like, oh my goodness, and there's Sean Baker, and there's Michaela Penn, and there's, and Amber Heard, and all these people have been, doing it for like 20 years.
Yeah. I know.
I was like, I'm in good company now.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes feel aggrieved that I just didn't know about this years ago, because my 20s and my teenage years could have been so much better in terms of relationship with food. And but yeah, I love what you say just about the ApoE4 gene, because we know that if you eat an ancestrally appropriate diet, such as a carnivore diet, then the risk of that gene leading to Alzheimer's just really disappears. So it's I just think it's absolutely amazing what diet can do, and taking a perspective where you step back and really consider where we've come from, and just really what's ancestrally appropriate. I think we live in a very toxic world these days on all different levels, and environment is absolutely huge. So I went through all of my psychiatric training, and there was a lot of emphasis on family histories and genetic risk factors. And I think when I was training, I came away with the impression that if somebody had a very strong family history of mental disorder, then it was almost inevitable that their children, their offspring, would develop the same disorders. And now, just with the knowledge I have in terms of metabolic health and the importance of nutrition and the importance of environment, and also just the functional medicine perspective, you come to realize that it's mostly environment that determines our destiny in terms of our health, and our genes are turned on and off according to the environment that we put them in. So it's partly about epigenetics and the impact that nutrition and diet can have on at a gene level in terms of increasing or reducing somebody's risk of disease, whatever that disease may be. So I suppose I just want to put a really positive message out there that there is so much that we can do individually to alter our course of illness and our ultimate health course, just by the lifestyle choices that we make. And a certain family history or genes shouldn't necessarily put anyone off from doing that.
Beautifully said, and that's a message that really needs reinforcing, I think. So thanks for that. And while we're on that topic of environment, what, aside from nutrition, what other things do you think play a really important role in our mental well-being?
Okay, so circadian rhythms are key as well. So the amount of natural light that we get, meal timing comes into it to a certain extent, but trying to limit the artificial, particularly the blue light, later in the day, particularly in the evenings. So we know that can lead to disrupted sleep patterns and disruptions in your circadian rhythms. So the natural rhythms that tend to happen in the body in terms of hormones and everything else that goes on. So you kind of want to have natural light exposure in the mornings, and then tend towards more red light exposure in the evenings, and not sitting in front of a screen. Or if you do have to do that, having a kind of blue light filter, that's ideal. I think managing stress is absolutely key as well. And that can be different for different people. So finding some way of managing stress levels, be it meditation or exercise, yoga, or, you need to just find something that is helpful in terms of managing stress, because your kind of adrenal system and your stress hormones, that all impacts on everything else we've discussed today as well. And there are studies showing that meditation and yoga and other types of interventions can have quite a profound effect at a cellular level. So it sounds very trivial when you say to somebody, walking is good for you and walking could be very beneficial in terms of your mental health, but actually these sorts of interventions can have profound effects, even if they're just an everyday thing that you might be used to doing anyway. Getting out in nature, I think, can be very therapeutic for people. And then there's a whole other rabbit hole in terms of toxins in the environment and kind of mold exposure and all those kinds of issues that can crop up for certain people.
But probably some regular exercise, really focusing on some quality sleep.
Yeah, and sleep is key.
Sleep is key, kind of. The street washer comes in and cleans the whole system for us overnight, and get up and go again in the morning.
Yeah, and we know that if you don't sleep well, then your hunger signals are going to be all knocked off the next day, and it affects your hunger hormones, and it just has profound effects. So very important. I
know when I don't sleep well, I just want to eat so much more, and that's when I sort of will have cravings for something sweet or yummy, Whereas the rest of the time I can not even think about food. I eat and I better have something to eat. Just the one other thing with the keto diet, and I'll raise this because this affects me, and probably maybe the ApoE44 gene is involved, but that some of us get very, very astronomically high cholesterol, and my cholesterol is 17, so nearly 700 in US numbers, which is phenomenally high. And I know a lot of people their GPs will tell them, don't do this diet because I'm worried about your cholesterol, or I'm going to have to add a statin to your medication list.
So I don't think high cholesterol is really something that people need to be overly concerned about, unless of course they have a highly inflammatory lifestyle where their cholesterol is likely to be oxidized. So that's including seed oils in your diet and having high levels of oxidative stress. So I think the research and the science has moved on a lot from the days of saying that the cholesterol lipid hypothesis theory of heart disease. And there are certain key cardiologists out there who speak on this topic. So Dr. Asim Malhotra in the UK is somebody who his book was great that he published, and I think it was called A Statin-Free Life or something similar to that title, and he's very well published in the literature. And Dr. Brett Scher is somebody else in America, another cardiologist. And really I tend to just try and keep it simple, and I think the key blood test that people need to pay more attention to is your triglyceride to HDL level. So your triglyceride to HDL ratio. And what we know from ketogenic diets is that keto diets tend to optimize your lipid profile in terms of reducing your triglycerides and boosting your HDL. And from what I've seen and what I've seen myself, people tend to have very good ratios of triglyceride to HDL when they adopt a ketogenic diet. And cholesterol is actually absolutely essential for the brain and for the body. So most of our cells have cholesterol in them. The brain is an organ that's very rich in cholesterol. And I think it's a bad idea to artificially reduce cholesterol levels. And I think, unfortunately, with the pharmaceutical industry, the statistics and the data that's been put out there has been skewed in terms of their marketing, in terms of the benefits of statins. So they tend to report relative risk reduction as opposed to absolute risk reduction. So when you actually look at absolute risk reduction, the benefit to an individual is very low for taking a statin. And yeah, I just, from everything I know, I don't think it's a good idea to be reducing cholesterol levels. Certainly not in terms of brain health, but also wider health in general. And I know there have been studies that show people with higher cholesterol tend to live longer. It's just unfortunate that this message isn't really out there in the mainstream. So most doctors you see will kind of panic at a high cholesterol level and try to get somebody to take a statin, and that's because they're not really keeping up to date with the research.
Mm-hmm. And I think once you hit 65, it always amazes me, when you're 64, you're at a higher risk. Once you're 65.
I know, yeah. Oh, it's all arbitrary, isn't it? So, yeah, it's dreadful the way we do that.
But anyway, give me another year and I'll be, my high cholesterol will then be protective. So I'll just wait it out.
Doesn't make any sense, does it?
It's crazy. Other medications that, sort of psychiatric medications that people might be on, or medications for depression or anxiety. I mean, I know that you're not giving medical advice, but I just want to know, do you see a decrease in the need to prescribe with this kind of diet?
Yeah, so what I have to say is, in terms of my NHS role, I work in a crisis service, so I tend to have only very short-term contact with people, and the Scottish diet is pretty horrendous. So I haven't been in a position where I've been seeing people through to the conclusion of their treatment when they opt to go keto, but I do know from other clinicians who have that a lot of people manage to reduce medication, some manage to come off medications entirely. And there was a study published earlier this year by Dr. Paul Danan, and Dr. Georgia Eade was involved in that study. And that was a really nice study of around 30 inpatients in France with a variety of different mental disorders, including schizoaffective disorder and bipolar disorder and major depression. And they had universal improvement in clinical symptoms in that study, but also many of the people in the study managed to reduce medications. Some managed to discontinue. And so it was a very impressive study that way. And I think that should guide people and should show them that it is absolutely possible to reduce the burden of medication and reduce the reliance on medication by adopting kind of metabolic or ketogenic strategies for their mental health.
And I would encourage people to share this interview with their GPs or their other, any other specialist doctors they have, if their GP is not familiar with using the ketogenic diet for mental health. And also Georgia Eades runs a program. I did it earlier this year. I know that you've done it in the past as well. Where she trains, medical professionals and other people like myself in using therapeutic ketogenic diets for those kinds of disorders. So, I'd encourage any GP or nutritionist or, anyone working in this area to go and do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there can be not very many, but certain medications that might contraindicate starting a ketogenic diet, or that might need to be changed before starting a keto diet. So you do need to know what you're doing. But I don't think that should discourage doctors from looking into this. And sometimes people require more support, so they might need some nutritionist input or a keto coach or somebody else to work alongside them to troubleshoot. So I think that can be a really good idea as well. But yeah, absolutely, I would highly recommend Dr. Reed's course for anyone, any clinician who's interested in just having a good grounding and basis in the theory of all of this, and also the practical application of this in a clinical setting too.
And I just want to say, I do think it's really important. I know it's tempting often when you hear interviews like this to just think, oh, I'll do that. And, you know, in New Zealand, GPs can be often very negative about this kind of approach. But I think it's, you know, this is one situation where having your GP on side of, you know, working with someone like, you know, me as a nutritionist, health coach, or any other, you know, we've got lots of different health coaches available in New Zealand, but you still want to make sure you've got that medical support behind you before you start playing around too much. Like you said, you know, there's medications where it's contraindicated. It needs to be done carefully and safely. Yeah. But I think if people wanted to make a start by ditching the seed oils themselves, I don't think that would do any harm to anyone. And for most of us, you know, and for most people listening, you know, if you've got, you know, those food cravings, if you have unstable moods, particularly for women, PMS, things like that, I found when I, you know, 20 whatever years ago, when I started eating lower carb, my moods were just so much more stable. And since I've been carnivore, they've just been amazingly stable.
I've had it's really hard to describe to people. So people talk about zero carbs then, and it's hard to explain, but I think it means slightly different things for different people. But just, I've had such a sense of optimism and self-confidence and reduction in kind of minor anxiety that I may have been affected by that experience in carnivore that I've just not had from anything else. And that's been very noticeable to me. And that was as somebody who didn't really suffer from any mental health problems. So I just think, what's the potential improvement for other people who are suffering that way? It's worth a thought.
Yeah. And like you said, just getting rid of the processed food, the seed oils, that's a great place to start. Eating even kind of going lower carb, but not necessarily all the way to keto. That can be a good place for people to start as well, just transitioning gradually. Oh, this has been absolutely fantastic. Is there anything else you'd like to say to wind up? Can you tell people where they can find you? They can get your book from Amazon on Kindle. I bought the Kindle version, but they can get the
so my book's on Amazon, so Metabolic Madness, and I wrote it just to really tell people everything that I want to say to people that I rarely get the chance to say, and to try to summarize some of the research that's out there and put it in a relatable way for non-medical people to see that there is such a profound connection between metabolic health and mental health. I'm on Instagram as Carnivore Shrink. So that's my handle on Instagram. And I have a website that I'm in the process of updating, and that's foodforthoughtpsychiatrist.com. So people can reach me either way.
Great. And are you on Facebook or LinkedIn?
No, nothing else. Nothing else yet. Maybe more to come.
Well, I really want to thank you so much for coming today and just sharing your wisdom. And I think this will be really encouraging for people to,
Yeah, thank you for having me and for inviting me on. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think it's so important to get the message out there. So all I would ask is just for people to have open minds and to do their own research if they want to look into things in more depth.
And I think share, if they share this interview, and there's a few other interviews out there with you, like with Sean Baker and, the carnivore girl and.
Bella, steak and butter girl. Yeah.
Yeah, steak and butter girl. That's the girl.
Yeah.
So there's other interviews with you out there. So I would encourage people to listen to them, share this, and just one last question, just about teenagers and young people mental health. Yeah, would that be, I mean, this is something I would think would be highly recommended for many of our teenagers.
Yeah, so what I would say is, when people are still growing, I think they can get away with having more carbohydrate in their diet. And so I don't know that absolutely everyone needs to be fully keto in their teens, but I think it wouldn't be a bad idea for others, and particularly those who are struggling with their mental health. I think it would be something to consider seriously and look into more. And even just, I'm thinking of people with, like, girls with polycystic ovarian syndrome as well. There are other health problems that are associated with hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance, and that would also be helped by adopting a keto diet. So yeah, I think it applies across the board. But yeah, those very, very active teenagers, sports players, they might get away with higher carbs for a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, over time you realize you can't get away with so much of that as you used to.
No, especially not as we get older.
Yeah. Well, that's a note to end on, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a good note. Thank you so much. It's been
you.
talking to you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye now.